several questions, major questions floating out there. I think Chris Hummer, as I've told you, did a really good job in his feature on 247sports.com, and there's like 150 questions in that feature, but I got a few more that I want to point you to tonight. One of easily the biggest transfer portal questions coming up in 2023 is, what does Notre Dame do now that they've added Sam Hartman? Sam Hartman was the quarterback at Wake Forest. I'm going to give you some numbers in a second that even if you watched him, you may not be aware of, but they've added him. Gerard Parker is elevated as the new offensive coordinator there. They had the whole thing, remember, with the Utah offensive coordinator, and he's coming. He's at the game with Marcus Freeman, so that means he's coming, right? Well, all of a sudden he's not coming, and then were they too cheap to pay the buyout or blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's in the past. Parker is elevated, so the tight ends coach is now the offensive coordinator. Notre Dame was 98th in pass yards per game last year. They weren't good. I mean, they, to put a finer point on it, were bad offensively. They were 2-4 when scoring less than 30 points. They were 7-0 when scoring more than 30. I would suggest that's a pretty key number for them to try and hit more often this year. But think about this with Sam Hartman. This is why there's obviously a lot of excitement. You know he was pretty good, and he was at Wake Forest a long time. Do you know that in the span of his career, Sam Hartman's career at Wake Forest, they were number one in completion percentage, passing efficiency, passing touchdowns, total touchdowns, all of those metrics, they were number one in the country during his career. And you may not have seen Wake Forest dotting the college football playoff landscape, but man, he played really good football, and now all of a sudden you just plug him in at Notre Dame. I keep seeing people say, why does Notre Dame have playoff odds as short, relatively short as they are? It's because they got a really good quarterback. That's why. Speaking of quarterbacks in the ACC, that's one. Sam Hartman's one that left the ACC, so he was at Wake, and now he's at Notre Dame. That's just the beginning. Look at what the transfer portal has done. Look at what they did to the ACC. So some of these guys moved around the conference, and some of them moved out of the conference. There are 2, 4, 6, 8. There are 10 names on the screen right now of quarterbacks who were starting, in most cases at least, in the ACC last year, and they moved at least programs, if not out of the conference outright. Devin Leary, especially if you're listening on podcast, you want to play a fun little game here? How well do you know your sport? Devin Leary, where did he transfer to NC State? Or where did he transfer from? NC State to Kentucky. DJ Uiagalelei, all the way from Clemson out to where? Oregon State. Jeff Sims is at Nebraska now. He was at Georgia Tech last year. Keaton Slovis, I guarantee you like 30 or 40% of our audience doesn't know that he's at Brigham Young now by way of Pitt. Phil Dracovic went from BC to Pitt. Brendan Armstrong went down the coast a little ways from Virginia to NC State. Jake Garcia is not at Miami anymore. He's at Missouri. And Jacoby Criswell. Frankly, I did not even remember this move happening. Criswell went from North Carolina to Arkansas. I can't even begin to offer you a prediction on who the biggest winner is there, who the biggest loser is. Obviously, Hartman's a very, very key name. But it could be that just Phil Dracovic, who had zero offensive line last year, goes to Pitt, and all of a sudden they're just good this year, and you're saying, I never really expected this. What if DJ was more a prisoner of having a bad offensive coordinator last year, and he goes out to Oregon State, and they up their level of play a notch, and it's already a pretty high level of play, and Oregon State's a surprise contender. You know, Oregon State's odds aren't nearly as long to win their conference as you think they are. Jeff Sims could just shock everyone at Nebraska. My point is, there were some players in some less than desirable circumstances last year, that's why they transferred, who are going to some interesting places. Now, let's go down south for just a second. I think we need to talk about Ole Miss, because Ole Miss doesn't have any one player. I guess you could look at quarterback if you wanted to, but even at quarterback, they added a couple of guys. You know, they added Spencer Sanders from Oklahoma State. They also added Walker Howard. These are both former, well, I would classify Sanders as a four-star player. Walker Howard, former four-star player. And they come in there and you may say, okay, which one of them is going to win the quarterback job? And then all of a sudden, you hear this, oh, Jackson Dart's in the trunk. He's still here? Yes, he's still there. So there are 3 quarterbacks that we have to keep an eye on at Ole Miss, but that's not it. They brought in 8 4-star rated players. That is tied for the most in this cycle out of the portal. Number 6 overall portal class. They have to replace 2 of their top 3 corners. They brought in 3 corners. So you got a couple of quarterbacks, 3 corners. Chris Marshall, remember that name? Where do you remember Chris Marshall from? He was one of like 17 5-star rated players that Texas A&M signed in that last class before last, that left. And that's a 5-star caliber receiver. Now, he still has to live up to the potential, obviously. And they got Trey Harris, who's a 4-star receiver out of Louisiana Tech. And if you think about the Southern equivalent of what UCLA is doing, it's Ole Miss. Ole Miss is sitting in a situation right now, and Lane Kiffin's been very vocal about it. He's been more vocal than Chip Kelly has. I'm doing more talking about Chip Kelly than Chip Kelly is. Lane Kiffin has said it's very frustrating for them to try and recruit heads up in traditional high school recruiting in the portal era, in the NIL era, because the relationships don't seem to matter as much. It's just about, who comes in with the biggest bag at the 11th hour. Well, they've adjusted. And so now he is going about things in a strikingly similar manner to the way Chip Kelly is. You may not get the kid out of high school. Oh, well, that's not your last shot. And frankly, after they get in college, you know more about them. You got far more dependable film to eval, and they've adjusted to college life, and they may not have the same priority structure in deciding where they're going to transfer to as they did when they were deciding where they're going to commit to. So, all of a sudden, maybe what Ole Miss lacks on National Signing Day, they're making up for by landing top 10 portal classes. What about Oregon? Oregon out on the West Coast is a really, really interesting story. Jordan Birch was one of the biggest signings in South Carolina football in a long time. And he never quite lived up to the billing on the field that they wanted out of the 5-star edge guy there. But then when you talk to some folks, they say, yeah, no, he has not. He's been very inconsistent, but we still think his best football is ahead of him. Now, you hear that all the time. So players they say that about are a dime a dozen, but sometimes they're right about it. Well, Jordan Birch is at Oregon now. Keep an eye on that. Also, that's a defensive room that's pretty stacked. That's a defensive line room that's getting more and more stacked by the day. Fun fact here, there are only 3 teams in the top 10 right now in the recruiting rankings and the portal rankings for this cycle. One of them is LSU, one of them is Oklahoma, and this is the third one, the Oregon Ducks. They're not far away. Mario Cristobal left a pretty full cupboard out there. Dan Lanning's come in, and one of the biggest immediate fears in the minds of an Oregon fan have been alleviated because talent acquisition hasn't fallen off. They still recruit very well. They are hammering the portal very hard, and Oregon opens week 2 at Texas Tech. Got Hawaii, got Colorado, and then they got a bye week before they go to Washington. That Oregon State loss and that Washington loss last year, it stung. It should sting. It absolutely should sting. So that's yet another team in this world where people tell you Pac-12 can't win a playoff game. Pac-12 can't even go to the playoff. Conferences don't go to playoffs. Teams do. And Oregon will probably be a really good team this year. Regardless of what sticker is on the back of their helmet, they'll probably be a really good team this year. And if I'm right about that, it'll be because of several players we just talked about.